don't use that word in here.
So, yep. The Matrix has me yet again. Got my Keanu scruff and scraggly hair all set up here as John Wick officially enters the chat, so to speak, in the Matrix. Full disclosure, I was originally going to write, shoot, and edit a video essay about this particular topic, and I might still do so later on. The reason I kind of put it off is just because it became a little too unwieldy for me to rein in, and I'm just like, I don't know if I'll have the time or patience to keep this beard for that particular project. And also, I decided to hold off until The Matrix Resurrections is released and I'm able to watch it, so that way I can get a very comprehensive and full idea of what is entailed in this franchise thus far, instead of just coming out with some expectations or ideas about the Wachowskis and their themes or elements of world building and then have it all completely dashed by Resurrections. But I still want to talk a little bit about why, after the Resurrections trailer dropped a few weeks ago, I still have this franchise on my mind, and I am just back full on into Matrix mode that I was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And a lot of it does now have to do with the fact that the Wachowskis' flair for exploring different spiritual, emotional, philosophical elements in their material, and the unique ways they go about doing world building, and how it sparks so much creativity in the viewer. Like, that's what it did for me here. After viewing the Resurrections trailer, I immediately had ideas in my head, running through my head of like, oh my gosh, where can this go next? Because I genuinely like the franchise a lot. I like a lot of the Wachowskis' work overall, but that first film, that first Matrix movie, resonated with me in a very profound way, wherein I loved the visual flair, and the effects at the time were very revolutionary. I enjoyed the action and the science fiction spectacle of it, but also it was one of those films where I'm able to kind of really get in tune with what the movie overall is trying to be about right away. Like, it didn't take any subsequent viewings. Just in that initial viewing, I got this. I attribute that all to how the Wachowskis are able to take these really deep, complex kind of reflections on humanity, identity, like I said, spirituality to some extent, belief, and make it accessible for a general viewing audience so effectively in that first film. And also, I appreciate their creative ambition, because the sequels further expand on these ideas, incorporating elements involving, say, artificial intelligence. How far does the rabbit hole go on their autonomy, on their self-identification of, say, having a soul or being true to their selves? Granted, the sequels aren't as concise or as tight in their execution as that first movie is. I will acknowledge that. I used to be of the mindset that they were far, far inferior. My viewpoint on the films in recent years has softened up a lot, just because I'm able to let go of a lot of the expectations I had placed on them initially when they first came out, and I'm now able to kind of see the bigger picture. And who knows, that might be something I may inadvertently do here with Resurrections, is place a lot of unfounded expectations on this next installment and perhaps set myself up for disappointment, but I don't believe so, because now I feel like I get this more than ever. And that's not to be some self-aggrandizing or patting myself on the back type of thing, because these movies aren't that overly complex to get. It's just that their accessibility for these deeper themes has never been so clear. has never been so straightforward, yet so engaging and entertaining at the same time. So I broke it down a little bit here to a couple of elements that I hope Resurrections continues and takes to some new territory that was established in the previous installments. The idea of, I mentioned it earlier, our true selves and transformation. Lily Wachowski, who's not involved with this new installment, it's solely Lana Wachowski helming this in this particular outing in The Matrix. But Lily mentioned last year in an interview that The Matrix is actually a metaphor for being trans. And again, it just became this talk that she had wherein she made it abundantly clear, like, yeah, absolutely. That is one of the intents of that original film, is to be sort of a metaphor for being your true self. And that does not exclude gender. I guess apparently originally the character of Switch was supposed to be an exploration of that particular element, wherein in The Matrix, Switch presents as one particular gender, but then in the real world, they're actually another gender. And so I found that really intriguing, interesting, and honestly, something that I feel we can explore now in this installment. We could have explored it back then. I kind of get why they didn't go all the way with it in that first time, just because of the landscape of media at the time, especially with regards to LGBTQ representation and it not being arch. Like, being able to present that idea in the story in a very sincere and non-campy, non-transgressive way would be a boon, I feel, to the franchise, and perhaps the territory in terms of the studios just wasn't ready for it. I hope it's ready now. It should have been ready back then to be able to handle that in a sincere way. I mean, I feel it certainly is. They were able to make Bound, which is a very overt tale about two lesbians who are in a relationship that isn't 100% meant to be salacious. They were able to tell that story then. And I hope they're able to explore some aspect of that in this new installment. It'd be nice to see that fully come to realization, especially since for Lily, she said she's not involved with this one, mainly just due to kind of like feeling personally exhausted, and there's been a lot going on in the siblings' respective lives for the past few years, not just in terms of projects, but their personal lives. So I can understand the desire to not get involved in a project that can take up a lot of your energy and emotion, especially if it's a personal project or has personal thematic elements like this one does. But maybe I hope that aspect of transformation, and especially transformation to acknowledge your true self, comes through in this film in the way that she intended with that metaphor. I feel that's at the core of The Matrix overall, is acknowledging and celebrating your truest self. It certainly is in play for Neo. It's in play for Morpheus, Trinity. It's in play for the villain, for Agent Smith. In play for even tertiary characters who kind of just get the plot moving, like the Oracle or the Merovingian. Truest self is kind of the heart and soul of the Matrix, and being able to not just acknowledge but to celebrate that proves to be the most liberating aspect of the characters in the plot. Another aspect that kind of harkens to this idea of true self is also the acknowledgement of names in the Matrix. Because, as we have seen from the trailer here for the new film, Morpheus is not the Morpheus we may remember. Lawrence Fishburne has stated he's not back for this sequel, and that the role of Morpheus has actually been handed off to actor Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. You'll know him from most recently the Candyman reboot and from the Watchmen series on HBO, I am curious how they're going to go about addressing that. Because there's plenty of different ways. Maybe it's actually Morpheus's son. Maybe it's someone having nothing to do in terms of lineage with Morpheus. Lawrence Fishburne Morpheus, I should say. Or maybe it'll come down to the idea that Morpheus isn't one person. Morpheus isn't necessarily the individual using that name. And it's something that I've always wondered about when it comes to the Matrix and their usage of names. Throughout the whole franchise, we know Neo primarily as Neo, but in the machine world, in the Matrix itself, a lot of the antagonists refer to him as Mr. Anderson, Thomas Anderson. That's very much who he was when he hadn't been given insight as to what the Matrix is, when he was still enslaved by the machines. The antagonists throughout the series use that name as sort of a very condescending, a very venomous type of slant against him. Anytime you have Hugo Weaving show up as Smith and say, Mr. Anderson, it's a very unique and at times humorous delivery, certainly that's been parodied throughout the years, but I've always read that as being this very contemptuous delivery. Like, Mr. Anderson is a name that suggests inferiority to Smith. It's a name that suggests I am far superior to you, fleshy thing. And this name will be a constant reminder that that's all you are to me. And I love just the bile and the vitriol he can put into that simple aspect, into just the name itself. Whereas Neo, everyone treats Neo as the name, as this spiritual like second coming, as the people say it with bated breath. In Zion, on the Nebuchadnezzar, people just say Neo. Like, there's such reverence and deference to the name itself. And even to Morpheus, to Trinity, there's this reverence surrounding not the characters themselves, because in the real world, they're just human, certainly, but around the legend and the name. And so that's always intrigued me about the Matrix, and especially with regards to Trinity and Morpheus, because we don't know anything about their previous lives, unless there's some really intricate wiki out there that I have not seen. There's not a lot pertaining to the actual canon background of Morpheus and Trinity and what those names actually kind of represent, other than, in the subtext for us, the viewer, we kind of get Trinity. Yeah, the very holy type of name, the Holy Trinity, of course. Morpheus, a very pertaining to many different kinds of myth and legend, like, for example, Lord of Dreams from Sandman and so forth. But I'm curious because in the first film, Neo is first and foremost presented as his hacker alias. What was the origin for Trinity? What was the origin for Morpheus as a name? Were they also fellow hackers who were awakened to the structure of the Matrix? Or was it something else? Why choose those names? It really gets my gears turning a little bit, the idea of like, what's in a name in the Matrix? Morpheus, is it more just to kind of represent an ideal? And perhaps this new character played by Abdul Mateen is emblematic of the ideal of Morpheus? Or is it just a straight up reincarnation of Lawrence Fishburne's interpretation of Morpheus? And again, a further exploration of the idea of names and identity and how that ties into our individual characters. The last thing that I'm hoping that this installment explores to some degree is a further exploration of hierarchy. And what I mean by that is the levels of control and power in the world of the Matrix. We've gotten that with regards to how the machines operate, how they view humanity as this resource more so than a species. and how they manipulate and control them in their own systematic hierarchy in the Matrix and in their fuel supply, essentially. And we got a little bit of the hierarchy in terms of how Zion, the last human colony on Earth, is set up. But I'm really curious if they'll delve a little bit into some ideas that were given voice in the sequels, but I didn't feel got too much fanfare, which is the idea of like programs controlling programs. The idea that all these operating systems within the Matrix have their own kind of systemic form of injustices against one another. The Merovingian is essentially a crime lord. The Oracle is essentially this street level kind of operating system that helps out the downtrodden. You have the architect, who is apparently just miles above everyone else, so much so that he's just pontificating in his solitary room, monitoring everything, and has next to no imagination about interacting with people or other programs. But I'm also curious if they're going to explore the hierarchy inherent within the human classes, because there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of some form of bigotry and wariness when it comes to humans that were born and raised naturally and the humans that are essentially pod-born, manufactured within the machine infrastructure for the sake of being power units in the Matrix. There's a line between, I think his name's Mifune, the leading Zion general, and the kid, who is a pod-born individual who enlisted for his infantry.
Pod-born pencil neck like you doing volunteering for my corps.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that looking down on pod-born people, and there's a lot to explore there in terms of the inherent imbalance between natural-born citizens of Zion and the people who are liberated from the Matrix. There's things to explore, darker aspects to explore with both of them. With the natural-born humans, there is that inherent kind of mistrust that probably brought them to the point where the machines and the AI decided to revolt and rebel. With the pod-born people, there is liability. They can be easily swayed, as we saw in the case of Cypher. They can be easily swayed to go against their fellow man for the sake of creature comforts, for the sake of, being ignorant again and being able to just be at peace in the Matrix. There's the liability that pod-born people can be corrupted by outside influences, like the Smith virus. That would be something really interesting to see, like where they're at that point. Like, have tensions escalated? Is there more unity and harmony between natural-born humans and pod-born humans? Does that really matter ultimately in the long run? Since there are these degrees of humanity in this world. And like I said, that could apply to the programs as well. And I think we're going to have a little bit of that here, since we have confirmed that Lambert Wilson is returning as the Merovingian, and that will have agents in play. Not Agent Smith, unfortunately. We're going to be down one scene chewer, but these are just ideas that I immediately started ruminating and reflecting on the second I saw this trailer, and that I'm excited for. Will I be disappointed? Perhaps a little bit, if it's just kind of a rinse and repeat installment, and we don't take the Matrix to some newer places. If maybe it looks like there's going to be a little bit more of a meta narrative at play in this installment. Like, you have characters outright, like, what's his name, Jonathan Groff, essentially just saying, it's like, after all these years, coming back to the Matrix. Like, there's a little bit of that rise, sort of like, yeah, right, audience? And I'm interested to see if there is going to be a little bit more of a deconstruction of the self, especially with regards to Neo and his role in this world, and what even the deal is going on with Neo. Like, is he alive? Is this just a program reenacting the algorithm of Neo, so to speak? what's actually at play in this new iteration of the Matrix, because it is a new iteration from when we left off in Revolutions. It's not the same construct as what the characters were introduced to in the first installment. It's changed, it's evolved. There's an awareness now, I believe, among the populace that they can choose to acknowledge or that they can live in blissful ignorance of. Maybe I might be momentarily disappointed if it is just a rehash, but at the same time, I'm still so appreciative of the scope and atmosphere and, again, that drive and ambition that's represented in all of these movies from the Wachowskis, that I'm just excited, honestly. And who knows, we'll see if I come back to exploring themes of the Matrix in a couple of months when we finally get a glimpse at the new adventures of Neo, Trinity, Morpheus, and associates. So, continue to acknowledge that there is no spoon.